Welcome to Wonderland, the podcast where I go down the rabbit hole to research things you may be curious about. My name is Amii, and I'll be your guide on this trip to Wonderland. Hi, and welcome back, my Wonderlings. I hope that you guys are having a wonderful start to the new year. As I thought about what my year might look like this year, I gave considerable thought to this podcast and how I do it. As with any creative project, it grows and changes as I grow and change. To help me achieve some of my personal goals this year, I'm introducing a new format for some of the Welcome to Wonderland episodes. Instead of me researching a topic and writing what essentially equates to an essay every 2 weeks or so, I thought it might be interesting if for some of the episodes I spoke with other people who are knowledgeable or passionate about a subject that we might be wondering about. So this year, look for a mix of these two types of episodes. For my first episode in this new feature format, I'm speaking with someone whose voice you no doubt recognize if you listen to this pod regularly. My best friend, Barrett Gruber.
Is this where I say hello?
This is where you say hello.
Okay. Hello.
All right, so this is Barrett.
The difference in you reading versus just speaking.
Okay, leave me alone.
All right, sorry.
So Barrett is the host of the All About Nothing podcast, which you guys know that I speak about regularly.
And What the Pot Is That?
And What the Pot Is That, which is a funny little podcast where they watch TikTok videos and then he and Zach and Carrie kind of comment on them.
Yeah, we send ourselves straight to the bad place.
And so as I kind of thought about this new format that I wanted to do, I knew that the first one had to be with Barrett. He's obviously such a natural on the mic and
owns the equipment.
Yeah, and he owns the equipment. So here we are with Barrett. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to wonder.
I 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 wonder.
All right. So you may be wondering what it is that we're wondering about today, and it's voting. So this is what Barrett is passionate about.
Yeah, one of things that I'm passionate about. Yeah.
So if you follow Barrett on his social media or All About Nothing on their social media, you'll regularly see posts and little tidbits about, hey, don't forget to vote. This is where you can go to vote. I actually think your website has a link to help people register to vote.
Well, yeah, the allaboutnothing.com/voter, you can check your voter registration. And if you aren't registered, then you can actually go ahead and register to vote through, it's a national website that does the check. But we don't actually retain any of the data that you put into it. It basically just goes into the registry and it verifies your registration. And then you can, if there's an issue with it, now's the time to update it. So.
All right. So this will be a little different than the way I usually do things. I did do a little bit of research, just the tiniest little modicum of research so that I wouldn't sound stupid next to you. I do vote. I actually help Barrett at the precinct, the voting precinct, but I don't know all that much about voting. So we've got Barrett. I did learn that the first documented instance of voting for a way of government dates back to ancient Greece as early as 508 BC. I actually would have thought that was earlier.
Or you mean further back?
Yeah, like earlier than that.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I hadn't really given consideration to how early voting started. Only because when I think of voting, for the most part, my mind tends to just stick to the modern. But yeah, because the Greek and the Romans had their elected officials, the Senate.
Right. And then bringing it across the pond over here to the United States, obviously, we elected George Washington in 1789.
And I asked the question, was that an open election or was that just?
It was an electoral college election.
Okay. All right.
I did look that up. So, but even before, because what I Googled was, when was the first election in the United States? And it kind of got me there. But then Native Americans were voting well before we got there.
Interesting.
There are documented instances of Native Americans voting on tribal elders and various positions of authority throughout the tribe as early as 1500.
Yeah. Wow.
And women played a large part in that.
Up until 1789.
Right. So, but 1789, we elected George Washington using the Electoral College. I was a little surprised. I was trying to figure out who was running the United States in the time after the end of the Revolutionary War and 1789, because that's not the same time.
My guess is that because the states weren't necessarily, it wasn't a unified country at the time. My guess is that the states were pretty much being run by their governor. They had governors and town councils and things like that took care of that.
Well, at some point they decided we needed like a federal government. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today specifically is our federal government, our state government to some degree, and voting and how that all works. So let's start with who can vote.
So in the United States, anyone over the age of 18 that is a citizen of the United States, whether they're born in the United States as a natural citizen or they're naturalized by becoming a citizen, can vote in an election. That excludes anyone in most states that have a felony conviction that prevents them from being able to vote.
So I actually did look up some things on felony convictions. Let's see if I can make this big so that I can take a peek here.
I know in the state of Florida, they had passed legislation to allow felons that had served their time to completion or had been given some sort of the governor had granted them clemency, that they would be allowed to vote. But I know that was then done away with before the 2022 election.
So this is the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL.org, but kind of a high-level overview. So in the District of Columbia, Maine, and Vermont, felons never lose their right to vote, even while they're incarcerated. So they can still vote while they're in jail. In 23 states, felons lose their voting rights, but only while incarcerated, and receive automatic restoration upon release. It says to note in Maryland, convictions for buying or selling votes can only be restored through pardon. So, like, if your crime has to do with voter fraud, then the governor, I guess, has to say, "All right, it's okay. You did your time. You can vote again."
Yeah. Who was it you voted for? Who did you rig this election for? Oh, me? Oh, sure. Why not?
In 14 states, felons lose their voting rights during incarceration and for a period of time after, usually their parole or probation period.
Yeah.
And then after that, their rights are restored. They may also have to pay fees and restitution before their rights are restored. So it kind of depends on, I guess, what they did again. And then in 11 states, felons lose their voting rights indefinitely for some crimes and require a governor's pardon for voting rights to be restored. And then they've got an additional waiting period after the completion of their sentence. And so there's a big long list, and it kind of goes through all of that. So largely, if you're a felon, you can vote asterisk.
Yeah. So after your rights have been restored, after you've served your time or been given clemency. So that, and ultimately, I think that's, you're still a citizen of the country. You're still paying taxes. Ultimately, I think that having your rights restored after you've paid back
your debt to society.
Yeah, I think that makes the most sense.
So, you said 18 was the minimum age, and the maximum age is?
There is no maximum age, I don't think. Is there?
I didn't actually.
Death, I assume.
And I have to assume so. I think Michael's grandma still votes, and she's 100 now. So this is not like a Lego situation.
Yeah, again, I think it's a situation where if you are paying taxes, the United States was from the beginning always very heavy on the idea that if you pay taxes, you should be represented. And that representation is a symptom of voting.
So that is a nice little leeway into, I want to talk a minute about women and their right to vote. And I think that it's relatively common knowledge that women in the United States have not always been allowed to vote. We've got the 19th Amendment to thank for that, which was around 1920. But I did learn that there were some situations where women were allowed to vote before 1920 and the suffrage movement. So basically, it has to do with tax paying. So if a woman's husband had passed and she was widowed and now she is paying the taxes on what's
Property.
left, the property.
Yeah.
In 1838, Kentucky legislature agreed that widows and unmarried women who own property subject to taxation for school purposes, that's specific in it, would be allowed to vote in elections relating to schools.
Always with the limitations.
Oh, no, it was definitely limited, but it wasn't nothing.
Yeah.
And then there's a nice little map that kind of goes through and shows when, as far as the women's suffrage movement goes, when the different states were allowing what level of voting. And that specific clause was an early one that even before full rights were granted, they were like, okay, well, I guess if your husband passed away and you still own this land and we're still collecting taxes on it and you have to do with the school system, then I guess you can vote on things that have to do with the school system.
Yeah, I think that it's crazy that it took finding little reasons for why to keep women from voting kept degrading over time to the point where obviously the Constitution needed to be amended and then ratified throughout the country in order for women to finally be allowed to vote in 1921.
And it wasn't even all women then. So
well, okay.
So
Sorry, white women.
Right. So, and guys, I will post the links to a lot of this research, these articles that I was reading on this. So it wasn't all women. And even some of the women who were heavily involved in making sure ultimately that white women got the ability to vote in 1920, they themselves were not white. One of the biggest activists was a Native American woman who was not allowed to vote. So I've got some additional information here on that. And there were a lot of different reasons that were given for why Native Americans couldn't vote. One of which was if they lived on a reservation, then that wasn't American land.
Well, and I think technically it's still not considered to be American. You know, it's not the United States. Those are a lot of the Native American reservations are considered to be their own nation. It's not that way anymore. You can vote in reservations.
Yeah. So, and it's not just Native Americans who are being suppressed with the voting. So, other people of color. So, originally, Black people, African American people, should have been able to vote after the 15th Amendment in 1870.
Right.
So the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, I mean, that seems plain and simple. They should be allowed to vote, right?
Right.
But that wasn't the case. So it wasn't until after 1965's Voting Rights Act that people of color were allowed to vote. And they had some really sneaky, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. They had some really sneaky ways of suppressing the vote, of making it so that African-American people who had been freed, who were no longer slaves, and then even generationally after that, still couldn't vote. What were some of those?
Well, you have literacy tests where an individual that comes up to mark their name to say that they're voting, they would selectively be chosen to perform a literacy test. And if an individual could not read the statement or read whatever it was that the poll worker at the time was trying to, basically it was a form of voter suppression. Literacy tests are a form of voter suppression. There was also poll taxes. If you couldn't afford to actually pay the poll tax, then you would not be allowed to vote. That was another form of suppression, despite the fact that the Constitution now allowed for everyone to be able to vote. In a lot of southern states, there were limitations put in place to try and prevent some individuals, in this case African Americans here in the South, from being able to vote in these elections because there was enough of a population that it could have turned the direction of those elections.
So I actually came across a pamphlet called What a Colored Man Should Do to Vote that was circa 1900. And this is the section. It's got basically for each state what's needed. This is the section for South Carolina. So must reside in the state 2 years and in the county 1 year and 4 months in the polling precinct. must be registered, and in order to do so must be able to read and write any section of the Constitution submitted by the registrars, and if unable to read and write, must prove to the satisfaction of the registrars the ownership of $300 worth of property in the state, upon which all taxes for the previous year must have been paid. All poll tax must be paid 6 months before election, and tax receipts showing the payment of all taxes, including the poll tax, shall be shown to any of the election officers at the polls. Any person convicted of a felony, adultery, larceny, wife-beating, or miscegenation. I don't know what that word is.
Miscegenation?
Mm-mm.
Misogyny? I don't know.
We'll look that up later, friends. is forever barred from voting.
That's crazy.
So literally they were passing these out so that it was an attempt to be proactive so that a black person could know this is what I have to do. I have to meet all of these and then I can vote. And then if I've done all these things, then they
not
can't
going to show up.
So
if you didn't meet what was on that requirements list, then you didn't show up.
So
now was that an actual state enforced law, or this was just documentation that was provided to the public?
I think it was based on the laws for each state because
Okay.
the different sections are different by state.
Gotcha.
So, and while looking at this, I came across something called the grandfather clause. Have you heard of this?
No.
So this is an extra sneaky way, I think, in the beginning. Basically, it said you could only vote if your grandfather voted. And then if your grandfather was a slave, then they didn't vote, which meant that
Right.
their son couldn't vote, which meant that their son couldn't vote forever, because never, ever would your grandfather have been able to vote.
Right. Yeah. That's crazy.
Isn't it? And it's legitimate, guys. Like it said that is something that truly happened in our nation's past. But now this is not the case. All American citizens who are over the age of 18 and not currently incarcerated,
Right.
everybody can vote, right?
Yep. That's the idea.
So to register to vote, I know you gave us a little spiel earlier about it being on your website. What does someone need to do to register? Because you don't just turn 18 and you're registered, right?
Yeah, no. Well, so there are in the United States, in a lot of states, there is a connectivity between the DMV, your Department of Motor Vehicles, and the county in which you reside that does allow you to register when you go in to update your driver's license. But in most states, individuals get their driver's license at the age of 16 or 17, which is a year or two prior to them being able to vote or for them being able to register. So honestly, the best way to go about it is just go to Google, put in your zip code, and then just say voter registration. And honestly, that is the best way to determine how to register to vote. Most places across the country allow you to register online. If you're at the DMV and you're not registered to vote and you're updating your license or your address or something like that, go ahead and just check off the box. They'll send the data over to the elections. I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Well, you only have to go to the DMV every 10 years now, though.
Yeah, I got to go in like 3 years because it's been 10 years. It's almost been 10 years since I went.
All right. So now we've kind of talked about, voting's origination, and we've talked about who can vote. What I did now is I talked to different people about some questions that they may have about voting. And unsurprisingly, many of them had to do with the Electoral College. So I'm going to play a quick clip from USA Today that gives a really brief overview of the Electoral College. And then we will turn to Barrett, who's pretty well versed on this. So
All right.
Here we go. Let me see if I make it play.
When the Founding Fathers were writing the Constitution of the United States over 2 centuries ago, they didn't exactly trust that the American people, or even Congress, could make the right choice for president. So they compromised and set up a system called the Electoral College, where even if a candidate wins the popular vote, they still might not win the presidency. Think Al Gore's loss to George W. Bush in 2000 and Hillary Clinton's to Donald Trump in 2016. The Electoral College currently consists of 538 electors, 1 for each member of Congress plus 3 for the District of Columbia. Each state is assigned a different allotment of votes based on how many people live there. In 48 states and D.C., the candidate winning the popular vote receives all that state's votes, the exceptions being Nebraska and Maine. Those 2 states assign 2 electoral votes to the winner of the state's overall popular vote and 1 to the winner of each congressional district's popular vote. For a candidate to win the presidency, they must secure at least 270 electoral votes, a majority of the 538. This so-called indirect election process has come under a lot of criticism lately, with detractors calling it undemocratic. Proponents argue the Electoral College ensures that citizens of less populous states are equally represented and stands as an important piece of American federalist democracy.
Yeah, that's the idea, is that the Electoral College is designed so that smaller states or less populous states carry similar weight to larger states. In the United States right now, we've got roughly nearly 330 million people. If you take that 330 million people, not counting any of the territories, Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, or there's a last one. But anyway, so if you exclude those territories, because none of those territories can vote for a representative or vote for a president, so they just don't get electoral representation. But those 538 are split up semi-evenly across the whole populace of the United States, which roughly comes out to about 670 to 700,000 people per electoral vote. What that does, though, is there are some states that, because of their population, whether it's larger or smaller, states like Georgia, they lose an electoral vote, where some place like West Virginia picks up a vote.
I'm going to go ahead and play a couple of the questions.
Sure. Sorry.
No, you're good. Because I actually think that you're pretty well answering them here. So,
all right. Let's not let your listeners not get their voices.
Okay. So, I think all three of these come from Cheryl.
Okay.
Why do we
that's
currently
Caroline.
have an electoral college?
So Caroline wants to know why we currently have an electoral college.
Yeah. It's the idea is that mostly it's to make it more even in how the votes are dispersed as far as for the presidency. Presidency is the only one that has anything to do with the Electoral College.
Oh, well, that's a good fact to include in that.
Yep.
That makes sense. All right, this next one I actually do think is Cheryl.
The number of electoral votes that a state gets, how's that determined?
So every state initially gets 3 electoral votes or electoral representation, delegates. It's determined by the population of the state. So every state gets 3. That's 2 senators and 1 congressman. You then get an electoral delegate for every congressional district that you have. So South Carolina has 7 congressional districts and 2 senators. So we have 9. California has 53 congressional districts and 2 senators, so they have 55. New York is 29. Texas is 29. But it's determined by your population and the number of congressional districts plus the additional 2 senators.
All right, so this is Cheryl again.
How does your personal vote feed into the electoral vote? How is it represented?
That's a good question, and it doesn't. Actually. And I know that seems weird and it might sound like an opinion, but the how the Electoral College works is that we as citizens that are voting, or we as voters in each of our congressional districts, if let's go back to 2020, and here in South Carolina, Joe Biden, who's currently the president, won he won 41% of the vote, where Donald Trump won 59% of the vote. Those electoral delegates are then assigned by the political party of the individual who won, and those electoral representation, they go to the basically the Electoral College process, which happens in early December, where those individuals will then cast their votes. So in South Carolina, it's a all or nothing state. And because Donald Trump won by basically 18% of the vote, he was given all of those votes. So all of those votes were then cast for Donald Trump. So that made up a piece of it made up 9 votes or nine electoral votes for Donald Trump in the Electoral College, so towards his 270.
So that's why those Maine and whatever the other state was.
Yeah, so Maine and Nebraska have their constitution allows for their electoral votes to be split up differently. So you have 2 districts you have 4 electoral votes in Nebraska. There's 2 overall votes, and then they split up their votes. So Omaha typically votes mostly Democrat, and then the rest of Nebraska is typically Republican. So you almost always see a split. You see Omaha, the district that Omaha represents, blue, and then
so that's like a 3-1
right,
instead of all 4 going to.
And then the last 2 votes in their Electoral College split go to the candidate that actually won the highest percentage in the state. So same with Maine. Maine, typically you see Maine will elect 3 of their votes to two of their votes will be given to whoever wins the state, and then the 2 districts give their votes or their votes go accordingly.
Oh, so your personal vote counts a little more in
Correct.
those 2 states. Okay.
Yeah, and so just the reason your personal vote doesn't necessarily count in your state is because you are voting in mass with everyone else with the electoral process.
Okay. So those are all the listener questions on the Electoral College.
Okay.
What did we miss? What did we not talk about with it?
I guess the reasons why we use the Electoral College, we did discuss that.
Well, according to the USA Today lady, that's because they didn't trust us or Congress,
right,
to make the best decision for the country.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes comes down to the last time that a president was voted both by the popular vote and the Electoral College by getting more than 270 was Joe Biden. Previous to that, Barack Obama was elected with both the popular vote and the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the only one that really counts.
Okay.
So
then the next question that we've got on here, we're going to shift gears a little from the Electoral College, and it has to do with mail-in voting.
Sure.
So here is. Normally, under what conditions is a mail-in ballot allowable, or when would they not want to do that?
Mail-in voting should. Mail-in voting is so prior to the invention of speed at which information travels, mail-in voting was one of the typical ways of voting. So even the 1700s and 1800s, people did vote by mail. The Postal Service did send in their votes through the Postal Service. Mail-in voting currently in a lot of states and more states, almost every election process, mail-in voting is something that individuals either apply to do mail-in voting, or in some states they will mail-in voting is actually just sent out in mass. So registered voters would in the mail receive their ballots, could then fill it out and send it back in. The restrictions on that are that it has to be in by a certain date, or it has to be postmarked by a certain date and received by the election office by a very specific date, usually the day of the election. So mail-in.
Can everybody do a mail-in ballot?
So not all states allow mail-in balloting.
My belief used to be, and I know that it's not necessarily the case, but my belief used to be that essentially it was just kind of for service people who are abroad.
Sure. Yeah.
Or that's absentee. What's the difference?
So mail-in balloting, so I think that's part of the misconception of absentee ballots should only be used by individuals that are unable to vote on the day of the election at the precinct that they're registered to. That's the idea behind the absentee ballot. South Carolina, the state that we currently live in, does not allow for mail-in balloting. There is no mail-in balloting. What they've done to kind of ease the tension of not having mail-in balloting is they have expanded early voting in South Carolina. So early voting is open for 2 weeks prior to whatever election, whether it's a primary or whatever. But we do have absentee balloting, but you have to apply for an absentee ballot in South Carolina. It has to meet a certain criteria, being that you're unavailable, your job doesn't allow you to, or you're a caretaker, or you're a school teacher, whatever it is that prevents you from actually showing up to your precinct on the day of the election.
Or in our instance, we work the polls. So.
Correct.
Okay.
So we have to vote early. We could absentee, but I'll vote early.
And we won't even actually get into that. So the next question here, I don't actually think has to do with electoral college or even the presidential vote. So this is Jenny.
Hi, Jenny.
There you go.
Hey, Barrett, it's your girl. What happens if there's a tie?
If there's a tie, I assume she means not the presidential.
Yeah, because that one can't tie. We learned this because of math. But like you on your show recently had Emily Mayer, who's running for town council down in Beaufort?
Yep, Bluffton.
Bluffton. And she made a comment in that episode that given that this is an off-cycle special election, it literally could come down to 2 or 3 votes.
Yeah.
Which also says to me if it could come down to 2, it could be a tie. It could end in a tie. What happens?
So in a situation where it is a smaller election, it just depends on how the town's creed is written or their constitution. But in some situations, they'd have a runoff election. Now, this is going to be in this one specifically, it's between 2 different individuals. I believe that in Bluffton, they already have a date selected for a potential runoff election if there is a tie or if there is a recount and a recount comes into a tie. In some cases, in situations where let's say a runoff election has already been done, and it still comes out to a tie, because chances are if there's only 2 people running and they go into a runoff election, everyone who voted for whoever they voted for is going to vote for that person again. And it really comes down to everyone has to show up. And in that situation, if for some reason there's a tie again in a runoff election, some cities, some states, and counties have a process where they'll either
rock, paper, scissors. Come on, tell me it's rock, paper, scissors.
I haven't seen rock, paper, scissors, but I have seen coin tosses.
Oh.
In fact, the Virginia legislation, as recently as 2017, had a situation where one seat came down to 1 single vote. And through the recount, it was determined that not actually. I take it back. It wasn't the recount. What happened was an election board determined that a vote that had not previously counted now did count, and it brought both candidates to an equal number of votes. And in that situation, it came down to names in a hat. So literally, they put both candidates' names on pieces of paper, put them into a hat, and then someone, I don't remember who, but someone drew the name out of the hat, and the name that was drawn was the winner.
Oh, man.
So
that was, I guess, fate for you there.
And that determined the power control of the Virginia State Senate or House for the next 2 years.
Oh, okay. Wow, guys.
Yeah.
So there's definitely still room for improvement in our voting system, I suppose.
Yeah.
And we vote for a lot of things. We vote for a lot of positions, but not all of them. Some are appointed. And we also vote for some. Talk to me, what is a referendum or an advisement question? Like, are these things you're actually voting on?
So referendums and advisement questions are 2 different things. Referendums are referendums are the state legislature putting forth an actual potential law to come in that allows, as a referendum, it allows for the citizens of that state to vote on a particular matter. The passing of or legalization of marijuana in many of the states across the country have actually come down to referendums. So it's actually been put on the ballot for the citizens of those states to vote on.
So in that instance, the states Congress or Senate. They're not making the decision. The people.
Correct. Yeah, that is actually being put to the people to actually make a decision. It's almost like a popularity poll that has weight behind it.
So what's the difference with an advisement question?
Advisement questions are used to give the legislation or the governor or whoever it is that puts forth the question, it gives them an idea of what direction their supporters would potentially vote if they were to, or how it would affect the people of a state or locality.
So what kinds of things do you see as advisement questions?
Well, South Carolina in 2022, there was an advisement question that was put forth that requested that citizens make a decision on whether or not state school board or school boards, local school board, could be potentially partisan. So the Republicans in the state of South Carolina put forth an advisement question that asked the question, should school board school board officials be elected? Should that be should they be represented by party?
So it's just a survey question.
Yeah, basically.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. So we, I know I've mentioned it intermittently throughout this episode. Barrett is a poll clerk, and I am a poll manager. It sounds like I outrank him, but I don't, because the clerk is the boss in the polling precinct, like they're who runs it.
Yeah.
He and I are working the upcoming primaries.
Yes.
So talk to me about what a primary is versus maybe a caucus versus maybe a regular election.
Sure. So we'll start with primaries. So primaries and caucuses are basically the same thing. It's just a difference in difference in the process. A primary is used by most of the states in the United States as a way to determine who the candidates for an election are going to be. A caucus does the same. A caucus also determines who the candidates are going to be to represent those parties. But in a caucus is basically a very aggressive, in some cases, shouting match between individuals. So essentially in a caucus, you'll have everyone in your district show up at a gym or a fireplace or a firehouse or something like that. Basically a public place where individuals who want to vote for a specific candidate will put themselves into those areas and then literally be counted.
Oh.
Yeah, they get herded into corners or spaces, and then literally they will get counted, and that's how a caucus works. But during a caucus, you will have individuals that are trying to sway people that haven't yet made a decision to come join them in their. Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy thing to watch.
And so states either have a caucus or a primary, or
correct. Yeah. South Carolina has primaries. Iowa has caucuses.
How many states have a caucus?
I want to say it's 7 or 8. I think Iowa, Nevada, and Nevada may not do a caucus anymore. I know that for the most part, most states are moving towards running just primaries because a primary is 12 hours long. You open the polls at 7 a.m. and they close at 7 p.m. A caucus sometimes will be a varying number of hours. It could be 1 hour if everything is done in an hour. It could be 4 or 5 hours if there's difficulty with counting the number of people. But like in that time period, you can't leave. You can't go to the bathroom. You're stuck until it's done.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Or your vote doesn't get count.
Well, I can see why they would move to the primary. And so caucus and primary are both specifically for president.
No. Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. For president. So in South Carolina, we have 2 different primaries. We have the preferred presidential primary, which is in South Carolina, we get to host the first in the South primary for president, which Joe Biden's up for on February 3rd. I'm not sure when the episode comes out, but and then the South Carolina will host the Republican primary on the 24th of February, which is 2 weeks later. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks. But those primaries are then used to determine how many delegates will be assigned to, say, former President Trump or to Nikki Haley or DeSantis.
Okay. And everybody who could vote in a regular election can vote in a primary, right?
Yeah, as long as you're a registered voter, you can.
And 17-year-olds, if they're going to be.
If you are going to be 18 at the time of the presidential election, then you can vote in the primary even if you're not yet 18.
All right. So my last thing on here is a Facebook question. I don't have any audio to go with it.
Okay.
And I'm going to say that listeners, if you guys listen to All About Nothing, you know that Barrett does have some strong political opinions, but we're not going to get into that here. But what I do want to talk about...
She's threatened me with sedation or some sort of a tranquilizer in case I start to stray. So.
Okay. I want to talk about voter fraud. And this is something that I think Cheyenne on Facebook was asking. But what kinds of things are in place to ensure voter integrity?
So that's not the easiest question to answer without it sounding political. So just understand that my recognizing what voter fraud is versus what you hear about in the news are two different things. So in the United States, because of the availability of voting, sometimes it seems as though there is a lack of security in voting. As a poll clerk and knowing how the system works, modernized voting, I think, is much more difficult to actually create fraud with, unless you have some sort of way to control how the software works and how, there's a paper trail involved in our modernized electing or voting systems. So when you go into vote, you have to present your driver's license, which then gets scanned into the system. Now, when you scan into the system, the electronic poll books that we use are smart enough to be able to determine if you have voted before, or if you in that particular election, if you had voted either in person, whether you voted by absentee, or if you are in the wrong precinct. Like it's a very intelligent system based on the most up-to-date information on your registration. Mail-in balloting is one of the concerns for a number of people when it comes to potential voter fraud. And I think that is probably the one that is the most likely to potential have influence that could create fraud, in that someone could go through and pick up, they could go through your mailboxes. If they know when the ballots are going to be delivered to people, then they could go through and pick up ballots out of people's mailboxes. But that's not really an easy thing. South Carolina doesn't have mail-in balloting because, one, there isn't the money available to send ballots to every individual. And I don't actually think that that's how mail-in balloting works in some states. I'm not entirely certain, but I think what happens is you receive in the mail an application or something to say, yes, I would prefer to vote through mail-in balloting, and then you send that back in. I'm sorry, I hit the microphone. And then once the election office receives that, then they submit it, and you receive, through the mail again, you receive your ballot. But your ballot has to be signed and witnessed, and which means that you are voting and saying who you are because you received your ballot at your registered address, and then when you seal your envelope, it goes in. Like the whole way that you do vote in mailing, like your ballot goes into an envelope that's sealed and signed. That envelope then goes into another envelope that's then signed and sealed, and then it's sent back. So, it's difficult to imagine much in the way of mail-in balloting causing or there being fraud attached to it. Absentee is the exact same thing, except that I think that it's even more difficult because they're not sending out the ballots all at the same time. they're sending the ballots out as the applications are received for voters that choose to do absentee balloting, because what happens is you'd have to know specifically when that ballot was going to hit that person's mailbox, and you'd have to be sitting there watching for their mailbox and the ballot to go in, and then to know to go over and pull that ballot out. There was a situation in North Carolina where a congressman's son was going around, and people that usually when you receive your absentee ballot or your mail-in ballot, you don't necessarily fill it in that day. And this individual's son and partners were going around and collecting people's mail-in ballots or their absentee ballots, and prior to them having been completed, saying that they were doing a service for them by going ahead and picking them up, and they would turn them in, except that they were then going into them and changing the votes. So that was a legitimate fraud.
So that's the kind of thing that people lose their rights to vote forever that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, except for the guy that was the representative is now running for representation again. He's running for Congress again. So.
Well, there's that.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't have any other listener questions. Anything that you want that we didn't talk about that you feel like is pertinent and relevant to somebody who might be wondering about voting in the United States?
I just say, even if you're not the type of person that considers yourself to be political, you still deserve to be able to vote for who you think is going to represent you the best. So do your research, know who it is and how it is that they represent themselves or what their policies are, because ultimately you don't want to be represented by people that don't necessarily represent you or have the same viewpoints as you. It's going to happen. Not everybody shares the exact same opinions, but I think in the end, the best way to be able to at least have an opportunity to be represented by someone that you trust or that you believe stands for the same things you do is you have to vote. So register to vote. If you have registered to vote, check your voter registrations. Districts and things change every year, potentially every year. So, check your voter registration, check it now, check it in 2 months, check it, a month before the election, just to make sure that everything is in exactly where it needs to be in order for you to successfully be able to vote. Walk in there, vote, get your sticker, walk out.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Barrett. I appreciate you being my guinea pig in this new format.
Welcome.
And for my listeners, thank you for joining both of us and learning about voting. I hope you learned something. I hope, in the very least, that you are registered to vote after listening to this episode if you weren't before. And until next time, be safe, be kind, and stay curious. The Welcome to Wonderland podcast is copyrighted by Amii Bland and is part of Big Media. This podcast is recorded at the podcast studio at GOT Sound Studio in Lexington, South Carolina, but this episode was recorded at Big Media Home Studio. Any thoughts or opinions expressed as part of this production are those of the hostess unless otherwise indicated. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow, like, and share this podcast. Find us on Facebook at Welcome to Wonderland the Podcast and on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, at Wonderland_pod. Check out behind-the-scenes moments and other videos on TikTok at WonderlandPod. And finally, check out pictures, additional information, and go further down the rabbit hole on our website at www.wtwlpod.com. To submit corrections, additional information, or requests for episodes, please email the host at welcometoWonderlandthepod@gmail.com.
That was good. I was impressed. I would have stumbled all the way through that.
I read it every 2 weeks.
Well, I'm just saying, I'd have stumbled hard.
Oh my gosh, so we did it. Thank you.
The preceding podcast is a product of Big Media and copyright 2024, all rights reserved.